I think we have a good group here. Thank you everyone for attending. I'm excited to welcome you to the latest in Global Endeavor Network webinar series. Today we have a panel discussion which focuses on the intersection of business and nature. For those of you who are new to Endeavor, we are the alumni outgrowth of the Endeavor Student Club, which is based at INSEAD. Our mission is to employ and to encourage others to employ business as a force for good in society. And I'm your host, Kiku Loomis. I was in the founding class of Endeavor in 1993. I also have a master's degree in marine biodiversity and conservation. So the topic of today is very dear to my heart. I'd like to offer an especially warm welcome to the current students at Endeavor and the Environment Club, Environment and Business Club, who are viewing this from their locations in Fontainebleau or Singapore. We're really excited to have the student representation. So just a couple of administrative notes. Housekeeping, this webinar will be recorded. The format will be short presentations by each of our panelists, followed by a discussion and audience Q&A. And feel free to put your questions directly into the chat while we're speaking and while you're thinking of it, and then we can pick up that during the audience Q&A section. Okay, so I want to discuss first, just set the table a little bit and discuss why we're here. Why are we here? This is Climate Week in New York City. And lots of discussion about climate going on. But as somebody in a panel that I was attending put it, we can solve the climate crisis today. If we could, we would also have to solve the biodiversity crisis, because what is left after we solve the climate crisis is very important. We have to figure out what our relationship is to the planetary systems that support us. So if you go to the next slide, Nicole. I wanted to, this is a very popular report, the World Wildlife Fund's 2024 Living Planet Report recorded a now 73% average decline in wildlife populations for the past 50 years. Now, this sounds like a very alarming statistic, and it is. These are not every species, it's not every part of the planet, but these are indications that we are having a huge impact on biodiversity and on nature in general. And if you look at the next slide, what are the primary causes? It's not a surprise, but the main drivers of biodiversity loss are human activities, habitat destruction, primarily driven by agriculture, infrastructure, people needing to live somewhere. These are all the land use changes, plus exploitation of resources, pollution, invasive species, and of course, now climate change. And so these are alarming facts. We understand where these drivers are coming from, but how is business involved and why is business involved? Let's go to the next slide and just look at the economic risk that is associated with the biodiversity loss that we're discussing and nature loss that we're discussing. According to the World Economic Forum, more than 50% of the global GDP is moderately or highly dependent on biodiversity or nature. Ultimately, until we find another planet, we are all 100% dependent on nature and the systems that support it. So what can we do? What can we do as people? What can we do as businesses to restore nature, to give back to nature, and create a more sustainable relationship with the planet that sustains us and our businesses? To address the question, we have brought three panelists together to talk about the ways that businesses are impacted by biodiversity loss, how businesses can help to stem the loss of nature and biodiversity, and to talk about really concrete mechanisms that people are using and best practices to bring the necessary financing to the local level where nature actually lives, and to promote both biodiversity protection and strengthen livelihoods. So introducing our panel today, Megan Pillsbury is an INSEAD MBA from 2007. She's an engineer, an entrepreneur, an innovation leader I've known for many years, and she is on a mission to reinvent the private sector. INDEVOR, former president, and she is also the founder of and CEO of Dunya Analytics. Philippe Dongier is also an INSEAD MBA from my class and from the founding class of INDEVOR in 1993. He is a past president of the INDEVOR Global Impact Network, and he's now the executive director of CESI, the Canadian Centre for International Studies and Cooperation. Drea Burbank is an MD technologist. She's an interdisciplinary thinker, a serial entrepreneur, applying high tech in critical sectors to solve critical problems. She is the founder and CEO of Savimbo, which sells fair trade carbon and biodiversity credits, among other things. Together, I think these three panelists represent critical elements of what I can conceive of as a global ecosystem that we need to help businesses become net nature positive. So before our discussion, I've asked each of them to tell us in a few minutes about their organization's missions, and how they function. So I'm going to hand it over first to Megan to tell us about her latest venture, Dunya Analytics.
Thanks, Kiko. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Kate Pillsbury. I'm founder and CEO of Dunya Analytics, and we provide science-based risk analytics for biodiversity and nature. I just wanted to add a little bit of extra context to why this is important for business. So all y'all are MBAs or MIMs and have been or are being trained in, economics and business management and maximizing shareholder value and all of that kind of stuff. And so it gets a little bit tricky when your primary incentives are around maximizing financials, like how do you bring nature and climate into the picture? And there was a very interesting report done by the World Bank that showed that while we've increased human productivity over the past 30 years by almost 50%, renewable natural capital has been lost by 20%. In other words, the planet is getting less productive at serving humans, and that is because of the nature loss that Kiku mentioned, the drivers for the nature loss, primarily being driven by how we do business. Luckily, this is now becoming a priority issue. There was the Kunming Montreal conference that happened back in 2022. You can kind of think of it as the Paris Agreement, the Kunming Montreal Agreement, where 190 some countries agreed to the global biodiversity framework. Similarly to what we have in climate, where we are aiming to keep warming to 1.5 degrees C, which I think we've hit, unfortunately. There are similar targets for biodiversity. So targets 2 and 3 create this 30 by 30 framework where we need to restore and protect 30% of land and oceans by 2030. And that doesn't look uniform across, so that doesn't roll out to every country protecting 30%, right? Some countries have a lot of rich biodiversity, others less so. And so the actual country deployments are different. And we need to have the mechanisms that kind of incentivize the right level of restoration and protection. But if you're a business, like, you'd be thinking about what kind of contribution that you can make to that. And I think that Dre and John will talk about those things. Target 15 is specifically about disclosures. So climate risk disclosures have been rolling out all over the world. The CSRD in Europe, I'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's also target 19, which is how do we mobilize enough funding in order to curb the biodiversity crisis and stop the loss and do the restoration. The CSRD is probably the biggest driver for these disclosures. For those who follow that space, there were initially 50,000 companies that were going to be in scope. It's now dropped down to 10,000 companies, but that's globally. So even companies that sell, I think it's 20 million annually into the EU, will have to do nature risk measurement and disclosure. And it all aligns to this TNFD framework. So the TNFD is complicated because nature is complicated. There's not like one metric, there's not one set of models in order to measure nature. It's actually quite a challenging endeavor to describe how a company has impacts and dependencies on nature. But all of these other frameworks are aligning to the TNFD. So it's kind of becoming the industry best practice on the approach. And similarly, the CSRD is adopting much of the TNFD guidelines for this is how you measure and disclose nature. So going back to when you're a business thinking about this, there's this is from the science-based targets for science-based targets network, science-based targets for nature recommendation on how you should start addressing biodiversity loss. And the first part is fixing your business. How do you avoid doing more damage to the planet? So there's a huge opportunity for businesses to think about what their business looks like when it's properly sustainable. What does that future green business look like? What's the path to get there? How can you ensure that you're doing actually restorative things to nature? And it's actually possible. A lot of companies have reinvented themselves for the green economy and are now nature positive or at least nature neutral. And then the next step that we need to do towards that 30 by 30 target is restoring nature. And so looking into your value chain, looking into the historical impacts that you've had, where do you need to reinvest as a company in order to help us get to this 30 by 30 target? And there are many mechanisms for that we'll hear about, but there's also good ways and bad ways to do that. And I'll just say, like, from our position as a company, we don't think that nature can be offset, right? So having an offset strategy as a way to address your nature impacts is not acceptable. You need to have a transformation strategy for how your business gets to net zero impact in its actual operations and its supply chain. So just quickly about Dunia Analytics, we are a 2-year-old startup, but we have an enterprise platform already launched, and there's a free version of our platform, so you can go sign up today. But we essentially automate this TNFD assessment process. So for companies that are getting started with nature or don't have large sustainability teams or just struggling to navigate the data and connect the dots, essentially we connect the dots between your basic operations, like what you do and where. We help you understand what's happening in those ecosystems, the impacts and dependencies that you're having on them, and how those translate into risks and opportunities for the firm. And the approach that we take is really about connecting nature and what the science says to your business financial impacts. And I think in our current economic infrastructure, where the incentives are around maximizing shareholder value, we need to connect the dots to the financial impacts that are happening today or are coming down the pipe for companies that fail to act on nature. All right, so that's all the opening remarks that I have, and over.
Okay, thank you so much. So many questions. It's so interesting to see start this conversation from a perspective of businesses. What I'd like to do next is let's have Philippe share his slides as well and tell us about somewhere further down on the ecosystem of addressing nature impacts. What can we do in a practical way to address them? Philippe.
You're on mute, Philippe.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay, well, so I'm Philippe, yes, and I lead an NGO that is working on economic opportunities for women and youth in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. But we look at doing that with a big focus on how to promote economic opportunity that also protect biodiversity, which is a growing issue, as you know. So this chart, in fact, is what Kiku talked about earlier. You know, the huge loss in the last 50 years of biodiversity, and one of the main causes is food system expansion. And what we anticipate, or what everyone knows, is that as a result of the very large population growth we're seeing now continuing in the world, and specifically in Africa, with at the same time large income growth in Africa, which is very much needed, where the growth is an imperative in terms of poverty reduction. This is going to drive much further growth of food system, of food production, and therefore we can anticipate, you know, without much doubt, a significant biodiversity loss really connected to this growth of population and growth of income and growth of demand. So let me actually move the slide. Okay. So this is the point about the population growth. As you can see, if you look between 2025 and let's say 2075, you know, the world is going to gain probably about 3 billion people, and almost all of that is going to be in Africa. And if you combine that growth of population with the growth of income, that's is likely to happen. This is going to generate huge growth in food consumption and huge loss of biodiversity. Now, this is, you know, producing risks on some of the major forested areas. So one of them that we're working on is West Africa. It's called Guinean forests. And just to give you that as a case, this forest cover in that particular zone has reduced by 20%, by more than 20% between 2010 and 2020 in the three countries we're looking at, which is Côte d'Ivoire, Ghana, and Guinea. And this is driven mostly by, you know, mining, both artisanal and industrial mining, but also the growth of cocoa production, you know, by companies like Mars, like Nestle, like Cargill, and by lots of small farmers who produce cocoa and sell it to companies. And that's basically reducing the forest cover and reducing biodiversity in significant way. So the question is, how can there be significant economic opportunity in a way that would not, you know, destroy the biodiversity? So that's one initiative that our organization is working on, just to give you a sense of what can be done, but then how to connect such initiatives with private capital so that companies, private capital can then flow directly to those communities that do something to protect the biodiversity. So I'm just going to describe how it's working. So it's basically a collaboration between the communities, the businesses in the area, as well as the government that put the rules of the game for what needs to be done there, and scientists to try to link the biodiversity initiatives with private capital. So obviously you need to measure, you know, what's your baseline and what changes happen. And here you have, it's a complicated field, in fact, of measuring, you know, how biodiversity evolves over time. You need to look at fauna, flora, land use, habitats, mix of environmental DNA technology. I mean, I could tell you about many of these technology, camera traps that actually capture the movement of animal, bioacoustics that listen to the noise of animals in the forest, genetic sequencing with samples that actually see how that can map different biodiversity species to a global database of biodiversity, remote sensing, very important. So all of these data can be used to do a baseline and to track over time. And then in parallel to that, you have economic opportunity activities, such as agroforestry, to basically have in the middle of cocoa plantations, trees that permit to build biodiversity actually, or reforestation of water sources, or exploitation of non-timber forest products so that people can live from the forests without destroying it. So there are various ways that you can have economic opportunity that actually protect biodiversity. And the idea then is to see whether these methods are actually having an impact. So we measure and see how it goes over time, but you have, in order to be able to market this as a biodiversity credit, you need to have some independent audit of this data and also an independent audit that demonstrates the causality between the intervention or the activity and the biodiversity impact. And then based on that, the plan, and here we are at the planning stage of doing the next step, which will be to issue and sell biodiversity credits. And that will happen in Ghana and in Côte d'Ivoire, where the regulatory system makes it possible. In Guinea, where it's less advanced, it's a different approach that we call certified adaptation benefit units, which is an approach which is simpler in terms of measurement methods, a bit less easier to trade, but creates also a robust, measurement framework that would allow payments for this biodiversity. And then once the payment flow, the idea is that the benefits are shared in a way that makes sense among the community that takes action, the businesses that also take action for this, and the government, which takes action in terms of regulation and monitoring. So they all contribute, and that's always a key question that has to be negotiated well. And the idea is to facilitate all that. Of course, you need to manage this process. And the idea is to do that in a way that's replicable at scale. So that's what our organization is working on, is to find a way to do all of this and to issue and get the payments to flow in a way that's replicable without having a lot of costs associated to this. Here I'm just comparing different approaches, the biodiversity credit I mentioned and the adaptation benefits mechanism. Probably won't go into that now, but just to say there are various ways to do this that are more or less complicated and more or less easy to then flow into credit markets. So I'll stop here and happy to discuss further.
Thank you. Thanks, Philippe. You mentioned biodiversity credits and some of the technology and some of the complexities of developing and putting biodiversity credits into the market. I want to introduce Drea Burbank. Her company is Savimbo. Sorry, organization is Savimbo. And Drea, why don't you share with us what your approach is and how it works?
Thank you. Yeah, so we're a social enterprise. Savimbo is how to save a planet. So we always joke that it's not like you should have saved that planet. Why didn't my neighbor save the planet? I will save the planet tomorrow. It's step-by-step instructions directly from Indigenous leaders on how to save the planet today. Now, this whole thing started because my friend, can you guys hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, this whole thing started because my friend Johnny had a jaguar in his backyard and he started following it around with the video camera and he stopped narco-trafficking and he became a vegetarian and an environmentalist. And most importantly, he convinced 300 of his nearest neighbors in FARC territory in the Colombian Amazon to do the same thing. And everybody was like, people do change, but it's not that common for somebody to make such a profound and fundamental change and for other people to follow them. And we study outliers at Savimbo as a way to enact behavior change. So we asked ourselves, why did Johnny do this? And everybody else in the neighborhood did too. And we decided Johnny did it because the jaguar was beautiful, it was wild, and it was bigger than him. And that's the way that I feel about our organization, Savimbo, because that's the way that everybody at Savimbo feels about the planet. We often joke to people that Savimbo is like Indigenous peoples and solarpunk had a baby. So we are the love child of the highest tech with some of the most consistent messages about the health of our planet. We started in this corner of the Colombian Amazon with a really high deforestation rate. With 3 founders who were dedicated to this or solution. So Johnny, each of us has deep expertise in our specific areas, and they're all very different. So Johnny has 20 years of experience in biodiversity conservation below the canopy, and he is one of the best jaguar trackers in the Amazon. I had about 20 years of experience in hard science and deep tech and frontier markets. And Fernando, sorry, I don't know if you guys can see him, but Fernando walked across the Amazon on foot. He knew most of the indigenous leaders in the Amazon and could call them and ask them to work with us. Those 3 founders are kind of the DNA of Savimbo. And I think the DNA is important if you look at our results. So we are the first certified biodiversity credit in the world on international OTC trading exchanges last week. We have 40,000 units, and we have solved the problem that people were complaining about, which was transparency, traceability, fungibility, the ability to purchase existing mechanisms. And that came directly from the DNA. And most importantly, we have a pipeline to produce more of those credits that anybody in the world can use if they are indigenous or a local community. Just taking a higher markets level perspective. Biodiversity is not carbon. Carbon has already been through the disillusionment, the trough of disillusionment, and now it's starting to standardize and yield value. We understand where the problems are and we're solving them. Biodiversity is just starting on its grand journey. The benefit of biodiversity is that it's running along a lot of the same standardized rails that they used for carbon. So double counting is resolved for biodiversity because we solved it with carbon and we're using registries and things like that. With the units, I think the most important aspect of the unit is we had to negotiate it properly. It needed a multidisciplinary viewpoint, and that solved a lot of problems. It standardized it for commodities market. And then now a lot of different people around the world can take different actions in different ecosystems and plug them into one unit. Our specific methodology is for indigenous-led conservation, which translates really well to Afro-descendant, African charter, local communities around the world. I would say that right now Savimba is probably 90% indigenous, but communities for our projects. But we're very collaborative, and we think that it's not an ethnic thing. It's about your familiarity with ecosystems, and that makes it a lot more universal. I have some North American Montana farmers that are really interested too. This is what the methodology actually looks like below the canopy. So this is 8 different indigenous nations with game cameras and indigenous trackers, and they collect the data. So there's a human component, a human intelligence component below the canopy that we think is more efficient, effective, and accurate than a lot of the sensor stuff that you see coming out. After that, we have very high quality data on very rare species. And so the methodology uses the case that if you find a panda in the forest, that's pretty hard to find. Therefore, your forest has to be pretty good, right? And so we use 50 different indicators in our pilot project, all of which have similar logical arguments to the panda. They're rare, threatened, endangered, trafficked. If they're there, they're indicating an ecosystem integrity, and you can use them as a moving sensor. So this is what the raw data actually looks like. This furry sensor can travel up to 7 miles in one day. And so if there's sound, air, water, hunting pollution, it's not going to be there. It's going to be somewhere else. And so it's a great, when you find it, it indicates, because it's threatened, trafficked, and an apex predator and also a totemic animal, it indicates a level of ecosystem conservation that other sensors simply can't capture. This is the algorithm that we used. This is an open source crediting algorithm that anybody in the world can apply to their data to print out biodiversity credits. And then we had very extensive third-party validation and verification to make sure that what we were doing was accurate. And we got an expert panel and a bunch of other stuff to standardize the evaluation protocol. That means that out of 400 companies on the biodiversity market, we're currently the only ones who both certify and are co-owned by and paying and cooperated by local communities. In macroeconomics, if you're into planetary boundaries, you can preserve a hectare of standing Amazon for 70% less than carbon using this mechanism. And the reason is the locals can do the science themselves. And so they also get 4 times more from that. So on an economic scale, it's a much more inexpensive way to stop deforestation in large forests, like the Congo, the Amazon. For unit economics, it's great for locals. So for $10,000, a local can start a project. Within 6 months, they're releasing credits to the market that are tangible and verified. And that can lead up to about 840,000 in revenue in a year for each community that joins, because our communities are managing vast areas of land in most cases on the border of deforestation hotspot, or sorry, biodiversity hotspots and deforestation boundaries. Across the world, we have about 40 projects. We're very selective about our projects. We have they have to be traditional leaders and they have to have forest under threat. And then we have an AI that we worked with Google, and I highly recommend it. It's called SpeciesNet. You can just ping their server and they will auto-identify your videos, which helps our indigenous trackers standardize their data a little bit faster. last thing, but not non-trivial, we used a app we developed with World Bank called Capital. So it's a capital with a K. It's like indigenous capital to pay collectives. So I can drop a lump sum payment into the community. The community automatic votes on it, and the vote automatically distributes their funding. So they have full autonomy. I have full transparency and traceability for my last mile payments, and I also have a much more easy automated mechanism to pay a traditional community in their language in a way they can understand. Um, I would like to invite you to join us and be pioneers of a solar punk future. We have worked really hard to standardize what people said couldn't be standardized. And the reason that we were successful is because Indigenous people really do understand biodiversity better than other cultures. And so we have not only interpreted a lot of the science, we have provided open source. You guys can read up on us, visit the site, talk to us anytime. And we would really like you to buy our biodiversity credits. It is an immediate action. It backs nature-based claims for businesses. And you can go to Davos, you can go to COP and say, we did something tangible this year, right now. We're working on our supply chain. We're going to fix it and we'll figure out our impacts, but we did something really good right now. And those things don't balance out. And we don't believe they balance out. We believe in rights of nature. We don't think that you can trade a jaguar in one place for a jaguar in another. But the actions can be synergistic. It's really important to not only do less harm, but also do some good. And we have really made it easy for you to do good in a place on the planet that matters a lot right now. And that's it.
Thank you, Drea. It's really, really compelling. And I'd want to start the conversation with a question for all of you. The first is, as I think Drea pointed out, we're at the very beginning of our biodiversity business Nexus journey. It's following in the footsteps of climate, which is an overall giant picture, that is really affecting biodiversity as well. But how do we get companies to focus on nature, to focus on biodiversity loss? How do we get them off the blocks? How do we get them to start participating? And maybe, Megan, you're the best place at this moment to talk about this.
So I've met a lot of sustainability leaders inside of companies. People care, people care about nature. But I think there's an incentives and economic infrastructure problem, right? So we've seen a business leader who decided to take a risk and say, we're going to create priorities around the planet. We're going to invest in this. It takes time. And they start down a path of, becoming zero impact on water or zero net positive on water like this. But because of the kind of short-termism of business in general, when those don't pan out immediately, those leaders get fired and they get replaced by people who just focus on the financials. And then while we've had, progress towards more ESG adoption and sustainability focus, the US obviously is not on that path at the moment. And so it even becomes it's doubling down on the risk of actually trying to do the right thing. So the question is how do you get a company, not people generally care, but how do you get a company to care about nature? And in the current infrastructure, you need to tie it to the bottom line. And that's why we built our platform the way we have. So it's easier for sustainability leaders to tell the story of, look, we're highly dependent on water. If we don't invest in watersheds and water restoration and water protection, we're not going to have the natural resource that we need to drive our business. If we don't invest in biodiversity protection and anti-deforestation, we're not going to have the pollinators and the clean water and things that we need to grow the crops that we sell. And we're going to lose that side of the business, or at minimum, there's going to be volatility in the markets and the costs are going to go up, right? So there's innumerable financial implications for businesses not acting on nature. And we just need to do a better job of making the business case in the current infrastructure Similarly, while that's happening, I think we need to reform economics. Economics isn't actually tied to any physical sciences, right? It assumes that nature is unlimited and free, which nature can regenerate, but it is definitely not unlimited if we can destroy it past a certain rate. And nature is the most important asset that basically the economy depends on, and it doesn't show up anywhere on the balance sheet. So, and then economics just assumes you can have unlimited growth, and economics depends on unlimited growth. So without kind of a reform in how we think about economic well-being and progress, it's going to be very hard for us to take action in time and at the scale that we need to take. You'll always have this like crisis of the commons with some people focused on financial outcomes while others are trying to go clean up after them. Anyway, I'll let some of the other speakers add in.
And Kiko, if I can come up on this.
Please do.
You know, there's a real ethical dilemma with this whole question of trading and offsetting. And of course, I think everyone would be against the notion that a company, you know, destroys nature and continues to do it without changing their ways, and at the same time tries to compensate by buying biodiversity credit somewhere else. So I think ethically, it's definitely, you know, something to be avoided. At the same time, what we're seeing now is that, you know, a lot of the big supply chains in the world, whether you're talking about renewable energy or you're talking about AI or, you know, the digital revolution that's continuing, it's using at present minerals in a way that do hurt nature. And of course, you know, there is a lot of effort needed to change the way business is done so that minerals are obtained without destroying nature. But as of now, there is a lot of mining that continues to destroy nature. And I think many of those companies and many of the users of, you know, clean energy and users of digital tools, all of us, are destroying nature. And therefore, we all have a responsibility to try to do everything we can to also build nature. And therefore invest or spend money on efforts that can, you know, protect biodiversity. So even without having a one-to-one offset logic, I think we still have an obligation to work on nature while at the same time our economy as today continues to hurt it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so I think it's that classic collective action problem that we're trying to solve here. I think one of the questions that came up for me while I was listening to your presentations about your organizations is that how do we connect to financing? And I think that Philippe, you had discussed that, but what is the mechanism that we can use to deliver the financing that we're going to need? Is it biodiversity credits? Are there some other mechanisms? Is it a group of mechanisms that work together to deliver the financing that we're going to need? I think it's upwards of $1 trillion over the next until 2030. So Dre, did you want to
$700 billion shortfall in biodiversity alone, and that's not all of nature. I mean, we've got to deal with water and soil, and so I would argue that a lot of people are trying to build a machine to fix nature, and that is really stupid. And Indigenous leaders are laugh at us for that idea, because that mentality is what caused the problem in the first place. So a lot of the approaches right now are like, oh my God, there's a problem and we got to fix it, but let's just keep doing the same thing we were doing to fix the problem. And so there is a mentality that helps here a lot, and nature will fix itself if we work with it. And the best way to convert money into nature is to pay a human that knows how to turn money into nature. A lot of people are just trying to pay nature off. Like, we're just going to buy a bunch of machines and that will fix the problem. And the mentality is really flawed. A lot of these solutions can be way more cost effective if we're simply willing to pay humans that know how to make more nature. And most of the humans that know how to make more nature or resolve nature actually don't do the work. They just know how to get nature to do it, or they stay out of the way, or they use more elegant solutions. And so this is a solvable problem. And I think we need to stop looking at these huge costs and say, oh my God, it's so impossible, we'll never be able to afford it. Because you really can't. You can't afford to buy nature. It'll never happen. Nature is an infinite cost when you've destroyed it. It's gone forever. The cost of an extinct species is infinite. And so, but that doesn't mean that nature won't just go make a bunch more polar bears if we can just stay out of the way. So we just need to change our mentality about this, that it's not actionable. I was just in a design work group with a really, I'm not going to say the brand, but it was a really reputable brand who has done amazing work around the world for years and years and years. And they were just talking about like, okay, what could we do to the building? And then they realized, oh shoot, we could put a few trees around the building and we lower our air conditioning costs. So you can actually lower your costs with nature. You just got to work with it. And so I think we need to have a design mindset. It's a design mindset that is hurting us right now. And it's a feeling that nature is against us and can't work for us or with us.
I agree 100%. When we get out of the way, nature goes back to its work. So we can restore nature that has been destroyed, and we can also protect nature. I think another question has come up in your discussion is that we have biodiversity hotspots, as Philippe mentioned, and we also have the cross section of businesses that are affecting nature. How do we reconcile the distribution of need? And I think where I'm going with this is, should we be focusing on high value ecosystems and biodiversity hotspots? And how do we do that? Working in tandem with businesses. There seems to be a little bit of a mismatch there because, businesses have their specific needs to draw upon nature, their impacts on nature, but we also have these high biodiversity, these high value ecosystems that we need to protect. Does anybody want to take up that question?
I'm talking to you.
Philippe.
Yeah, but let's give it to Philippe and then I'll weave.
Sure. Well, I mean, these hotspots are some of the most valuable assets of the planet, and they are assets for the local communities, they're assets for the world. And we really need to work hard at protecting them, obviously. And I think everyone has a responsibility here, because all of us who consume electricity, who use a phone, who are today on this platform, we are consuming things that are hurting several of these hotspots. I mean, you see all the mining happening around forests in Africa, in Latin America. That's just in Canada, everywhere, and that is directly impacting negatively the biodiversity. So this responsibility is global, and the challenge is how to flow funds coming from this responsibility to the places where it's needed. And you asked earlier the question, what are the options? So I think biodiversity credits is a very good option, but it requires a lot of data, a lot of verification. It's not easy. I think it's great to see Drea's initiative that's actually making it feasible, and it's a great demonstration that it's possible. But I think that's one very good option. There are others, like I don't know if you've heard of this new tropical forest forever facility that Brazil is promoting. The World Bank is also behind that, and several others. And here the idea is that funds would flow to governments of countries where those hotspots are located when they succeed in protecting the forest. So it would be a result-based fund that would provide funding to governments that actually succeed in protecting the forest and conserving it. That's one thing that's currently floating as a big proposal globally. It's the proposed fund is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And then you have this other thing I mentioned earlier, this adaptation benefits mechanism, where the unit is not a biodiversity credit. It's called a certified adaptation benefit unit. Here, the World Wildlife Fund is behind this, the African Development Bank as well. It's much simpler to do the measurement for these units. So in a way, it should be easier to do at scale, especially in countries where the regulatory regimes are not yet very much in place. So I think there are a number of options, but all of these are ways to flow funds from all of us who are responsible to the protection of those hotspots.
Yeah, I just want to comment on what Megan's doing because I think it's critical. I don't know if you guys can hear me. I look a little
Yes.
bit frozen.
Yeah, you're a little
Yeah, we
frozen.
can hear
We
you.
can hear you.
Okay. Great. So I just want to comment on what Megan's doing because it's really critical. These it seems at first glance that these systems don't interoperate. For instance, I was talking to TNFD and they were like, we care a lot about carbon, but we care a lot more about barrels of forever chemicals in rivers. And that's what we're working on. If you drop a barrel of a forever chemical in a river, then it has a different impact profile. So I'm working on an area-based unit, and I just dropped an agroforestry one into the chat, so you guys can see a comparison between that and our conservation credit. But those are kind of area-based enhancements that fix things at scale, and there is an interoperability between those two things. So Megan is helping companies stop dropping barrels of forever chemicals in rivers, and we're working on area-based uplift. So I have you can use Inga alley cropping to reduce mercury in a contaminated river. And so there's an easy interoperation between that, and I'll post it in the chat. But just because we seem different doesn't mean we are. There's really a holistic thing, and a part of it is figuring out what to measure. So you're not measuring everything, you're measuring key points to show that interoperation.
Right.
And can I add also, Kiku, there's, and I'm not an expert on this, but there are like industry initiatives that do look at more the collective, right? So as an individual company, maybe you don't have a lot of power over something, even though from the outside it seems like they do. But there are a number of industry collectives that are working on either self-policing or pooling funds to invest in change. I'll also give an example. One of our customers is doing a restoration project. It is community-led, it is in their value chain, and it is from a region where they source. So it's the way that they justify it is to say, we depend on this region, and so we need the ecosystem there to be rich. So that is like the business case inside the organization. But then they're kind of following what the community needs, exactly to like Drea's and Philippe's point, like you need to consult with the people who actually know how to do this well, right? And lean on them, not tell them this is how we want this money spent, and we want you to buy these technologies, and we want you to implement that. Like there's definitely that, but the way to do this well, and the way that companies can then evidence the fact that they've done it well, is to start with the communities and what they know and how to tap into that. And then tying it back to the value chain. So I was speaking with somebody earlier this week who knows like a bunch of project developers and communities that are trying to get funding. And they're like, how do we tap into corporate finance or your corporate funding? And my advice was like, you need to find the companies that have historically operated in that area and approach them as to like how it connects to them, how it connects to their business relevance. And then I think you're more likely to find this synergy between the local ecosystem or the area that needs the support, the community that can deliver it, and the financing and the business case for the companies that have the money.
Thank you for addressing that. It was kind of a provocation, but I do think that this reveals that there are connections and that we also need an all of the above approach. This is a very big problem that we need to solve, and it's global. So we're here at Climate Week here in New York City, and I couldn't ignore that. We're also in the middle of a General Assembly. The climate, the political climate, I would say, or the sort of the cultural climate has been a little bit challenging in the past couple of years, I would say, both for climate activists and for nature activists. I'd like to ask if we can comment a little bit on what you guys are seeing here, either from the General Assembly level, from the UN level, or from co-participants in Climate Week.
I can comment briefly. What is really interesting right now is you could argue that we're in a little bit of a crisis of government, because the polling suggests that 66% of the general population around the world, just globally, wants radical climate action. And we're seeing some hesitancy on the behalf of governments. So some countries are just making it super clear. They just don't want to do anything, and they don't even believe in it. But the vast majority of companies in the last week countries came back and with very radical action plans. And I think it's a conversation at both the citizen and the government level, and also at the corporate level, is how. And I think that we need to, when people ask me what my political affiliation is, I say it's a pragmatist. Like I'm just a pragmatist, and pragmatism crosses the border between a lot of this ideology into action plans. And I think that from the corporate end, because that's what this discussion is for, we also need to really think about how to de-risk brand experimentation. So I always advise corporates when I talk to them that they should position their action strategies as experimental and innovative and iterative,
Mm.
and get more of a design thinking group. And the most successful brands that I've worked with in the last 3 years, and the ones with the best PR profile for climate, have that approach. They have laboratories, they pair their best internal scientists with external scientists, and they play. So a spirit of that is really helpful.
And that's good to hear. It's heartening to hear that, we're seeing forward motion despite the atmosphere. Um, we have about 5 minutes left. That went really, really fast. I have 1,000 more questions, but we're going to have to wrap up soon. So I'd like to do a lightning round with our panelists to talk about what it is that individuals, both as citizens and as business leaders in the participating on this webinar can do. And maybe let's just go in the same order we started with. Let's start with Megan.
I think vote, vote right to your representatives wherever you are, whoever represents you in government. Make your voice clear that when you're unhappy about what they're doing or not happy or unhappy about what they're doing or not doing with respect to climate and environment. Because I think policy is the biggest driver. And if our voices are loud enough, well, we need to get our voices loud enough that they overpower those who are benefiting from the current system, who have very powerful voices at the moment. But we are more powerful if we are outspoken about it.
Give that 66% a boost. And Philippe.
I would say that, each of us individual and all of the companies we work for, we work in or we lead, are partly involved in hurting nature. We need to change our behaviors. We need to sensitize our leadership ourselves to how to do it. And we need also to contribute by buying biodiversity credits to actually, produce nature value and rebuild it. Because if we continue on the track we're on, I think the world is really on a very dangerous path. And I want to add one thing actually. There is this proposal to give voice to citizens directly and not just to governments. It's going to make, the idea is to make democracy much more based on people's real wishes, and to hear that 65% of the world population wants more radical action on climate is great. So we need to find ways to give voice to that. Now, how do we each do it? I don't know, but I thought this is a really encouraging step that Drea was mentioning.
Yeah, I can briefly say it's there's an innovation coming out of Europe that's essentially government like a jury duty. So the citizens sign up and there's a random selection. The citizens are paired with an expert and with expert advisors, and then they collectively make decisions. And there's a lot of evidence around the world that these mechanisms work more effectively for long-term decision making. Most governments aren't in power for very long, and climate is a long-term problem that requires a cohesive strategy, but also like a united front. And so that's really putting a test on a lot of our governing structures. And this is kind of an interesting innovation. I'll drop the platform, but I think citizens' assemblies, they might be adding them to the COP. I would hope they do. And that would really help give the citizens voice that we need, but also involve people more directly.
All right. Well, it's that time. I have to thank the panel for joining us today and for taking the time and sharing your organizations with us. If anybody on the webinar would like to get in touch, maybe you can put your information in the chat if you'd like. And I just have a few people to thank. First of all, I'd like to thank our co-promoters, the Hoffmann Institute. Kim, thank you. You're in the webinar. The Women in Business Alumni Club, our co-promoters, the Alumni Association of the US, Canada, and Colombia, and the Netherlands, as well as the INDEVOR Student Club and Environment and Business Clubs. I have one last call for action, and that is that the students of at INSEAD right now are asking for mentors. So if there is anybody on this webinar who would be interested, and I think, Nicole, you have a slide to throw up there. If anybody is interested in becoming a mentor and speaking with students about the sustainability career or a career that touches on social or environmental impact, then please get in touch with the students using this QR code. Um, and with that, I'd like to thank the Endeavor Global Network and all of my colleagues for all the volunteer work that they do to bring these webinars together. I'd like to again thank our panelists, thank all of the participants on the webinar, and Nicole, thank you for doing all the hard work in the back office and with the marketing. Okay, with that, thank you very much, and have a great day or evening wherever you are.